He tries to frighten me, but I'm not scared. Legend has it that's what Leo Tolstoy said when he read Leonid Andreyev's writing. Harsh judgment, really, because Leonid Andreyev has been since called a Russian Edgar Allan Poe or Russian Stephen King, even. It's just that Leonid Andreyev's brand of fear and horror is slightly different. Let's explore. If you're looking for a more fun version of a Halloween video, then I might direct you to my video from last year. There I talk about vampires, witches and such in Russian literature. This time we'll talk scary stories, but not the fun kind. I thought about picking one of Andreyev's stories to talk about in depth. For example, The Seven Who Were Hanged seems appropriate, but it only scratches the surface of all of the darkness that Andreyev had to offer, so let's talk themes instead. A spoiler warning as well as a content warning for all of these themes. Andreyev was a prominent author of the Silver Age. At a certain point, he was considered to be second only to Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy himself praised the first of Andreyev's stories to become popular, a story called Silence. He even gave him an A. Tolstoy had that habit of grading the stories that he'd read. Abroad, with the wave of popularity of Edgar Allan Poe, the public was looking for something similar, so Andreyev quickly got translated, and that allowed for a certain level of popularity and literary legacy and influence. For instance, Howard Lovecraft had Andreyev's stories on his shelf, Red Love and The Seven Who Were Hanged specifically, so while I'm not implying a direct influence here, you might be able to see the connection. Unfortunately, Andreyev's popularity was relatively short-lived. Today, he's not likely to break the top 10 or even top 20 of the Russian authors, and there might be a reason for it, but not necessarily the lack of talent or because his books are bad. It's just simply they make for a really uncomfortable read. Andreyev started writing and publishing his stories in the last decade of the 19th century, but these early stories don't have the same punch to them as his later stories. One of the well-known ones is Little Angel, very much a Christmas story. I read it last year, but didn't include it in my Christmas compilation, because it didn't sit well with me. Now I know why. The story smells of Andreyev, of the atmosphere that permeates all of his writing, so it might not necessarily be the feel-good Christmas story. Before I dive off the deep end of the true darkness that Andreyev has to offer, let me point you to the most, well, not light-hearted, there is nothing light about Andreyev, but the most, mild story of his. This one is probably the closest that Andreyev comes to horror in the Edgar Allan Poe sense, and that's the story called He, written in 1913. In a true Gothic fashion, it is set in a mansion on a coast in the middle of nowhere. A young tutor arrives to teach the children of an eccentric count, a count who has a dead daughter who's recently drowned, and a young wife who does not come out of her room, and the only sounds that can be heard from her is the piano that she plays. And the family is creepy. The count that forces the entire family to dance and laugh to the piano that his wife plays. The son who seemingly seems to pretend to have human emotions. And then there is this ominous he who in the night looks at the tutor sleeping from the second-story window. The story ends with the tutor running away and losing his mind. The story would probably come closest to what we now call a Halloween story, because while it does hint at the deeper themes of Andreyev, it's probably one of the milder ones. It has the creepiness factor to it. Andreyev is atmospheric in general, painting a picture in the atmosphere as well as the emotional state of his characters. So he can simply be this creepy story about a mansion and its inhabitants. But it still hints at these deeper motives of Andreyev beyond the fear and unease. As I go through these stories, look out for the loneliness of a man, the madness, the personal transformation, and questions without answers. The story that truly brought the popularity to Andreyev was a story called Silence, written in 1900. That's the story that Tolstoy praised. The story is based on real-life events. A priest that Andreyev knew, that once baptized him, was not particularly liked by his parish, and then his daughter committed suicide, and nobody could really figure out why. These same events play out in the story. A priest's daughter called Vera one day just stops talking to everybody, her parents, anybody. She locks herself up in her room, and when her parents implore her to tell them what's going on with her, she answers them with silence. And then one day she's found on the train tracks, an obvious suicide. Dead silence descends on the priest's house, and nobody dares to break it. He then goes to his daughter's grave and cries out as to what's happened. And on this hot summer's day, a certain chill creeps up his spine, and the only answer that he gets is silence. You will see it more and more as I go through the stories, but Andreyev is incredibly powerful in creating these images that are so lifelike and they stick with you. Here you can almost hear this silence. You feel this chill that has no place on a hot summer's day. We don't actually find out what's caused the daughter's suicide. Andreyev is not focused on that. His forte is emotions that he evokes in us. I like to view him as a painter, as a poet. He simply creates this image for us and tries to evoke emotion in us. He's not trying to teach us a moral lesson or provide us with a judgment. He's simply showing the scene to us. And here, this is this god that answers his priest's cry with silence. It's not that he doesn't answer him. The answer is silence. The daughter's name, by the way, is important. She's called Vera, which means faith. His faith is silent. This is also as good of a time as any to point out Andreyev's relationship with religion. There is some debate as to whether or not he was religious in a traditional sense or a true believer even. I don't really care. From what I can see, he did believe in God. It's just that his relationship with his God is more strained, I guess. At times it feels like his God is the one that's abandoned its people, the one that they cry out to in outrage, but find no recourse. Andreyev is seemingly in constant conflict with his faith, or at least in constant exploration of it. He's looking for something, he's looking for answers. His stories often feature priests, for example, the life of Vasily of Thebes, another rather unsettling story about a Father Vasily who goes through his own exploration of his own faith as his life falls apart around him. First, his son dies, his wife starts drinking, then gives birth to a replacement son who turns out to be retarded, then the wife dies in a fire, and then it all falls apart, really. I personally needed to take a breather once I finished the story. It's so raw, so overwhelming. The sound of the bell from the story was ringing in my ears, as well as Father Vasily's voice as he tries to raise the dead. It kind of sticks with you. Andreyev's texts sometimes feel like music that builds and builds and builds to this crescendo, but he doesn't give you that release, so you're stuck at that precipice, all strained and tense, and you need to find a way out of there yourself because Andreyev doesn't give it to you. And that's what makes Andreyev's text so unsettling to me. He writes about terrible things, but he does not help you feel better after it. He does not give you that release. His stories often end abruptly. He just puts a dot there and that's it. You're left to your own devices there. He does not have long endings, no epilogues. Simply a man lying on the ground, dead, his faith lost. But beyond this exploration of faith and humans, Andreyev also looks to the Bible, seemingly looking for answers there, but only raises more questions. In his story Judas, he looks at Judas as Jesus' most faithful follower, who understands that he needs to betray him for people to see and for Jesus to fulfill his purpose, so he almost becomes a martyr. And in Lazarus, Andreyev asks what happens to a person who's seen death, has seen beyond the veil, and came back to us, to our plane, in this body that's already started its decay. What would a man like that do back here? And what happens to him and the people around him? Is Lazarus' resurrection truly a blessing, or is it a curse? And in his unfinished story, The Satan's Diary, where the devil comes to Earth disguised as a human, he shows that true evil does not come from Satan, nor from the supernatural forces. Andreyev knows perfectly well that true evil comes from people. And isn't that more frightening? Andreyev, with all his popularity, was still heavily criticized, not only for offending the more religious folk amongst his readers, but also simply for bringing these vices up to the attention of the people and shining the light on them. His most controversial piece is probably The Abyss, another very unsettling story about a young student who goes on a walk with a girl, and in the evening, in the secluded part of the woods, they stumble upon some men who knock the student out and rape the girl. When the student comes to and finds the girl violated and unconscious, he rapes her as well. And the thing is that it is terrifying. Andreyev doesn't go graphic here, he doesn't need to. He simply takes this heinousness of a man and shows it to us. How a man can turn on a dime in these in-between spaces where he believes the laws don't apply to him. How a person's morality can simply just fall away. It's actually one of the tools that Andreyev uses to expose a person's true nature. He puts them in these frontier spaces, on the brink between life and death, between sanity and insanity, mind and soul, as he, as well as the existentialists, believe that that's where the true nature of a man comes out. In this story, it was twilight and the forest, normal in-between space, but for Andreyev, it's also men going mad, or people almost committing suicide, or men awaiting execution. Another story with a similar motive is the story called Darkness, where a young revolutionary needs to spend the night somewhere before his scheduled terrorist act, so he goes to a brothel. During the course of the night, he goes through a personal transformation from this little, pure, naive idealist who believes himself to be good to fully submitting to the darkness that envelops the brothel and its inhabitants. He embraces the sins and the pains of the prostitute and takes them on as his own, while she almost mirrors him and almost becomes a revolutionary herself. Here, Andreyev almost seems to ask if goodness can exist at all. Revolutionaries were incredibly topical during Andreyev's time, especially the earlier revolutionaries of the 1900s. Andreyev eventually turned his back on the revolution that caused the split between him and his good friend Maxim Gorky, who fully embraced the Red Revolution. But these early revolutionaries, we call them SRs, their modus operandi was terror, predominantly suicide bombings. They were happening all over the place. But if caught, if captured, the sentence for that was death. 1900s were also awash with capital punishment, so Andreyev couldn't pass that up either. In The Seven Who Were Hanged, Andreyev shows how people deal with their own mortality, but not just simply mortality, but their upcoming execution. Out of the 7, 5 are revolutionaries who were caught before they could commit their terrorist act, and other 2 are simple criminals. Andreyev attempts to explore the state of mind of people who are about to get executed, from denial to acceptance, but the main punchline is that at the very end they're alone. There is no glorious purpose to it all, simply people face to face with their own end. That's what Maxim Gorky criticized, actually, because his thing was like, why aren't they thinking about the revolution and the socialism and all of that, but why are they thinking about their measly existence? This is a story rooted in the questions of existentialism, something that Andreyev studied. If you know anything about Sartre, Camus, or Nietzsche, you will find them all over Andreyev's writing. I'm gonna level with you, I do not know enough about existentialism, nor have I read Sartre or Nietzsche to talk on it in detail, I just simply know that it's there. I've also read a paper that connects Andreyev's brand of horror with existentialism in Kierkegaard and Heidegger, and what they called ahnged. This existential terror that is present in all of us, and that actually makes us fully realized as people. Before I go into the most powerful story by Andreyev, let me tell you quickly about the story that I like most, and that hits also on a different motif in Andreyev's writing, and that's the tragedy of a lonely individual, and that's the story called Thought. The story is built as a series of notes of Dr. Kezhintsev, who documents his thought process that led him to murdering his fellow doctor. It's interesting because in the beginning he appears sane and rational, then you start questioning him and thinking that he might be mad and not realize it. And in the end, he poses the question himself whether or not he's mad, but he doesn't have an answer for us. And it's a rather interesting insight into the human psyche, how it's rather difficult to say what's going on in there, both from the inside and from the outside. Andreyev has a number of stories that he dedicated to people's madness. That's the topic that he was interested in exploring, the state of the mind of the person who's maybe not as sane as the rest of us. That is, if the rest of us are sane as well. There is a beautiful bit in the story called Ghosts, where the doctor of an insane asylum in the evening goes to a bar, and the language used to describe the patients of the insane asylum and the bar patrons is the same, and it's beautiful. I don't think that Andreyev claims to be correct in his interpretation of the human mind, disturbed or otherwise. Andreyev in general does not provide judgments or voices his opinions, really. He does not do complicated allusions or anything. His stories don't have a rigid structure. You get what you see. It's just that you as a reader might not agree with him and his interpretation. That's all it is. And now the most poignant piece by Andreyev, Red Love. Something enormous, red and bloody, was standing before me, laughing at toothless love. That is the red love. When the earth goes mad, it begins to laugh like that. You know, the earth has gone mad. There are no more flowers or songs on it. It has become round, smooth, and red like a sculpted head. Do you see it? Yes, I see it. It is laughing. Look what its brain is like. It is red, like bloody porridge. It is muddled. It is crying out. It is in pain. It has no flowers or songs. And now, let me lie down upon you. The story consists of a series of diary entries, first of an officer who participates in an unnamed war, how he retreats with his soldiers, leaving the wounded and the dead behind, how he goes along with the doctors to retrieve the wounded, and the doctors and the medics start losing their minds, how two regiments of the same army in the haze of a battle attack one another in a pointless battle, all the while this red laugh rings in the air. The officer loses both of his legs in that battle and he gets to go home, but he's not the same. The family is devastated by the state of him, but tries to humor him and allows him to write because he was a writer before all of this. But all of his writing comes out as this unintelligible scribbles until, in the end, he still passes away. The diary is taken over by his brother, who also starts losing his mind because of what's happened to his brother, but also by the echoes of the war that he sees even in the peaceful city. You would think that this story was inspired by the First World War, but no. That was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, a rather devastating loss for Russia and a great loss of life in general. Andreyev was called out for writing about war based on paper clippings that he had and not personal experience that he didn't, but that's not fair because the story is not written in the style of realism that we're so familiar with. Expressionism, however, and Andreyev, when he writes expressionism, make no claim to be objective. Red Love is his subjective view of the war and how he thinks it affects the human and the world. Andreyev views war as this disease, the madness that is going to overtake the entire world if left unchecked. The earth as this organism that is soaked in blood and laughing at humanity. He paints a picture of people, individuals, losing their minds in this pointless war, like this officer, for example, who, in the haze of this violence and barbarity, completely forgets what connects him to the protagonist, who was his fiancé's brother. This entire story is full of blood and death and laughter. It almost holds you by the neck and doesn't let you go. The central image of a red laugh or red smile came to Andreyev once when he saw some men killed in an explosion. The men who were just laughing a moment ago, and this smile was stuck on their dead faces covered in blood, a red smile, a red laugh. He gives the same red smile and red laugh to the metaphor of war, the destructive nature of it all. Andreyev was also accused of almost falling to the dramatics and the grotesque of it all to try to evoke the emotion from us, but that's the entire point. He wants us to have an emotional reaction, so all of these depictions of blood, dead bodies and madness, they're all here for it. Andreyev wanted Red Laugh to be accompanied by the sketches by Francisco Goya called The Disasters of War, but the story also reminds me a little bit of The Apotheosis of War by Vereshchagin. Behind the window, in a livid, motionless light, stood the Red Laugh. Red Laugh is probably the best example of Andreyev as expressionist. It is built entirely on imagery and emotions, if only disturbing ones. Andreyev's time fell on a really turbulent time for Russia, so it's very easy to blame the darkness of his stories on it. You can see the roots in some of the plot lines and storylines that are based on real-life events, like the terror in Russia or the wars that shook it. So yes, real life provided some input. But at the same time, even based on limited information provided by his friends, Andreyev appears this troubled individual who always lived on the extreme. Maxim Gorky noted, Leonid strangely and painfully sharply split himself in two. He could sing Hosanna to the world one day and then proclaim anathema to it the next. It looks like Andreyev might have had some mental issue. His multiple suicide attempts and alcoholism point to it. But while his later attempts were driven by heartbreak, his first suicide attempt speaks differently. He did lay on the train tracks, but the point here was to see if he survived, then God, fate, or life had some purpose for him, and if not, then so be it. The train did pass over him without harming him. And it looks like the purpose that Andreyev chose for himself, or saw for himself, was to write and to bring to people's attentions what he saw. And what he saw was the horrors of war. How a man could change on a dime, how the darkness lingers in all of us, and how there might not be escape from it. He wrote about these atrocities because he saw it as his duty, without even considering the cost to himself or the reader, really. Writing some stories left him shaking, and us as well. Andreyev pushes our buttons. He wants us to have a reaction. He wants us to feel. It's not sadistic, but it's close enough, because he does not hide from what he sees, doesn't turn away when red laughter is ringing in his ears, and does not let us turn away either. He wants us to feel this horror, and he's not going to be the one to soothe it afterwards. Andreyev also liked photography and painting, but while his photography is nothing particularly exceptional by today's standards, look at his paintings. For him, it's always this anguish, this torment, or nothing by halves, all in. And Andreyev was all like this, loving quickly and passionately. He once proposed to every female on a theatre troupe within one season, drinking until he couldn't stand up, writing for days on end, forgetting about the outside world. If you're looking for answers, you won't find them with Andreyev, but he asks a lot of questions about life, about human nature. He shows us the uglier side of it all, the one that we tend to look away from. So while these are not the fun kind of Halloween stories, they might be more in line with All Hallows Eve or Samhain. So, happy holidays.